Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Jorge Valdano once said. My name is Jack Pitt-Brooke from The Athletic. I'm joined today by John Brewin and by Tariq Panja from the New York Times. Now, it's a really big weekend this weekend. Sadly, I'm going to Jonathan Wilson's wedding, which is a shame because I really wish that I was going to Glastonbury. But maybe you're lucky enough to be going to Glastonbury this weekend. Maybe you're listening to this podcast on the M3 right now or on the train from Paddington Station. Maybe you're already there. And if you are enjoying it, and if you really want to help us spread the word, why don't you tell some people at Glastonbury about us? Maybe when you're standing around with the other 40-year-old dads waiting to see Weezer on the other stage, or maybe when you're trying to squeeze into Woodsies for Fortet, or maybe when you're stood around waiting for yet another Billy Bragg-led panel at left field. Or maybe when you're reluctantly heading down to the southeast corner at midnight one night, you might be wondering at that point, am I too old for this? Am I too old to be trapped in a crowd of tens of thousands of people in the middle of nowhere just to listen to some obscure electronic music and then wake up in a hot tent after 2 hours sleep? And maybe you are, but you're not too old to listen to the Libero podcast or to leave us a nice review. Now, we're starting off today by talking about one of the men of the summer so far, John Textor, who seems to be connected to so many big stories in football at the moment. And Tariq, I think a lot of people don't really know who this guy is. Can you explain who John Textor is and why he's always in the news?
John Textor, skateboard champion. That was his claim to fame as a youth. He claims to have skateboarded at an extremely high level. He hasn't made the Tony Hawk video game, so I'm quite dubious about how good he actually is. Anyway, he's a businessman involved in all sorts of things, including something called Fubo TV. That seems to be where, if he has made any money, that seems to be where he would have made it. And this is a kind of a streaming platform, minor streaming platform that has grown. I think it's grown after he left, where you can watch, among other things, a lot of international football. Having looked at John Textor for the last couple of years, I've still no idea if he's got any money. What he does have is a collection of a load of football clubs. And this is what we're talking about. You know, we've talked about multi-club ownership, and this is where John Textor, through this company, Eagle Football Holdings, emerges. So what does he have? He has, we'll get into what's happening with Palace, but a bit of Crystal Palace. He's like the biggest owner of Crystal Palace, but he doesn't have much power there. He owns Molenbeek in Belgium. He owns Botafogo, one of the Rio football teams that has been the champion of Brazil most recently, but also won the Libertadores in South America. And he also owns, or let's see how long he's going to own them, Lyon, fair to say a French football giant. And this is where it feels like, I'm not going to say House of Cards, but someone might. This might be where everything may be coming to an end.
So am I right in thinking there's sort of two parallel stories at the moment, right? There's the potential exit from Crystal Palace, where he's a minority shareholder with 43%, and there's also the separate process in France between Lyon and the French Ligue about their right to play in Ligue 1 next season. Is that right, Tariq?
Yeah, it's France is slightly different. It has a licensing body separate to the league called the DNCG. I'm not going to get into the French for what those letters mean, but essentially every club has to be licensed anew every year. And there was always this question about Lyon because its debts are enormous under Textor, who bought the club from Jean-Michel Aulas a few years ago for an incredible number. I remember thinking, I think it was 800 million euros. A lot of that is borrowed money from private equity. So a lot of the tick box, what's wrong with football exercises are kind of here. And the licensing authority, a couple of days before we were recording this podcast, said, sorry, you are not up to snuff. You are going to be relegated to the second division. And it's enormous. Lyon, under Jean-Michel Aulas, grew into a massive club within the French context and a big club in European context. 7 leagues in a row before the arrival of the Qataris. and now they've been demoted to the second division.
Because, John, we all remember Lyon as being, not just the dominant force in French football, but kind of held up as a model club, right?
Yes, the Soccernomics book that Simon Cooper co-wrote, when would that be, like 2009, 2010, Lyon were, the paragon club, weren't they, of how to build and rebuild, where you have talent and then you sell on the talent and then you re-up, and then you fight and to become a major European force from essentially a standing start. This character, I didn't recognise him from the skateboarding scene. What's that film called? Is it Dogtown and the Z Boys or something like that? You ever seen that documentary? Fantastic. Do watch it. Excellent. But it's of the great skateboarders of the 70s and 80s. No Textor in there, so I can work out, but I'm sure he can pop an ollie better than any of us three here. Yes, the thing about someone like Textor is that he's not alone in this world, in that Americans saw European sport as a gold rush, didn't they? Because the rules in American sport, you have multi-sport ownership rather than multi-club ownership in American sport, don't you? But you have to put up your own money. I believe in the NFL, I was reading in a book by a guy called Miguel Delaney about you need 1.5 billion and it can't be raised by leverage. You've got to put that 1.5 billion in yourself to buy, say, an NFL club. And so if you move into the European market, there's this opportunity. Soccer is seen as, unconquered wealth. We've seen the way that, say, Manchester United, not from a standing start because it was always a good merchandising operation, grew its revenue around the world by cutting stuff up. And I suppose someone like Textor sees opportunities and is in just about every territory in the world. Tariq has just run through them. And I suppose France is a special case because, as we've discussed on Libero before, it's not a great market. The TV market has crashed horribly. There's always been this argument, and I'm not going to use the phrase Farmers League, that it's a league in which it's not really built around commercial grounds. It's almost like a junior league for quite a lot of other clubs, despite proud history of certain clubs. And it's actually tightly run, and they don't mess about with the finances. We've seen a lot of French clubs suddenly disappear. Bordeaux, of course, where Andy Carroll was playing quite recently, of course. Funny, isn't it? I think all of us were Euro 2016. Both of us, all three of us, would have been to Bordeaux and Lyon's new stadiums built for that tournament, and there they are, lumbered down the leagues. Lyon Stadium, by the way, nowhere near Lyon, is what was my recollection of that. I don't know if you call that.
Like a Ryanair flight is what I'd call that.
Yes, one of those, definitely, Tariq. Yeah.
Do you think that if you're looking at why Lyon have gone the way they've gone, I guess there's kind of I can think of a few possible explanations. One is that the decline of the French league in terms of, the TV money's obviously been a complete failure. This is something that's been written about really interestingly. There's the fact that PSG have come and they've won so many. I think they've failed to win the title twice in the Qatar era, really. Once to Monaco, once to Lille. So to an extent, that means that Lyon and Marseille and Bordeaux and so on they can't really compete at the top end anymore, and that obviously restricts your ability to earn prize money and Champions League money and so on. But also, I was wondering, it always struck me that Lyon was such an effective, almost like a kind of like gatekeeper of the market. They would go and they signed Malouda from Guingamp and sold him to Chelsea. They signed Essien from Bastia and sold him to Chelsea, and Ndombele from Amiens sold him to Tottenham. They got Paquetá from Milan, sold him to West Ham. Bruno Guimaraes from Brazil, sold him to Newcastle, as well as having an academy which produces players like Benzema, Lacazette, Cherki, who just sold to City, Tolisso, who went to Bayern. So they've met, with a lot of those players, they've managed to make a huge profit based on their ability to recruit from within France. But nowadays, it feels to me like Premier League clubs have kind of drunk their milkshake. Premier League clubs don't need a go-between to sign someone from Amiens, Guingamp or Bastia, right? They can just go straight in. So do you think that kind of model of the kind of market gatekeeper has declined a bit?
That's quite a good point in terms of everyone. We've talked about this in a few of these editions we've done recently, in terms of the transfer market. There's so much expertise. It's very hard for there not to be a player that everyone is aware of who's got any degree of quality, depending on what level you are. Whether you're looking at all these various scouting platforms or Y Scout and the like, plus intelligence. So that's one. But I don't know. Like Lyon were well set as well. France gets more than one place in the Champions League. Lyon, with the city they are in, with this enormous fan base, they got within the continent, they got great fans over there who show up. The TV deal is one thing, but that affected all of the teams in the league. I think personally, a lot of this is down to do with the type of owner, where you've got these. In this case, they're American. I'm not going to say all American owners are like this, but why are they in it? They are in it to profit from a model, and it's not their money. So it's quite easy, I think, to really have a gamble with someone else's money. But what it puts at risk, all of these clubs. So I'll talk about Textor in a second, but it's just come 6 months after, a year after, we had this issue with 777, this another fund with a brash American front man. In that case, it was Josh Wonder. And I think it only unraveled because they tried to buy Everton, and they get toe-to-toe with the British media in a way, because we check and we look and it's a good story, we're going to go after it. But this guy, or this group 777, who do they take out? Genoa, very old Italian football team, and their fans are now suffering. Hertha Berlin, same situation. Vasco da Gama in Brazil, and I think there was a team in Belgium, and now we've got this guy. So what was Textor's aim here? He was going to bundle all of these clubs together, stick them into one entity, which is Eagle Holdings. And the plan was to go and list them on the New York Stock Exchange and IPO the business, and then all the cash comes into him, and the problems are going to be for whoever are the shareholders of this. Now, I was talking to someone the other day. They said, do you remember the financial crisis in 2008 when they were chucking in all of these bank loans together and then flogging them? You can look at that and you think, God, this is football. These football clubs, they're so historic and so old in many cases and mean so much. And the fact no one is taking care of this stuff, it gets me kind of frustrated every time you see it. Now, what's going to happen now? Who knows? But we're now putting another 4 clubs potentially at risk.
John, do you think this really strengthens the case for a more European regulation? Like, this is the kind of thing that ideally you'd have UEFA or even FIFA regulating on, but I think what we've seen with the attempts to bring in a regulator in the UK is that it's difficult to regulate in just one country when football is such a global business.
Well, I suppose it would help if all the countries were in the EU, but obviously that's part of it. But yes, actually, you make a great point about the regulator. The response to that from the Premier League. The Premier League suddenly tightened up its rulings, didn't it? It suddenly, to profit and sustainability, which was not really being noticed before or discussed before or ever been, countenanced by the Premier League. And it suddenly become a big part of what they were doing to try and show the government that there shouldn't be a regulator. The clubs are resistant to that. I mean, what Tariq talks about, this slicing and dicing of clubs' assets and stuff like that. And, I mean, we've seen it. I mean, remember the Watford example, where they would have, it was Palermo, wasn't it? And then players would turn up at Watford, and then for a brief period they had Granada, and then suddenly, was it Palermo? It was Palermo. Was it Udinese? It was
Udinese, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So we've seen it before with what was happening, where they had Udinese and for a brief period Granada, and I think remember a season where Udinese were doing quite well, and suddenly it seemed like a couple of players ended up at Udinese, and then suddenly all the assets were placed in the Watford basket, and now obviously, none of those clubs are doing particularly well together. I mean, just looking at some of Textor's his charge sheet, to use one of a better phrase. I mean, he's blamed Jean-Michel Aulas for some of it, saying he's hid the money. That's always the classic thing, isn't it, on a takeover? And that thing you talked about, Jack, about the youth setup that they had, they was talking about they're going to have to get rid of it as part of the restructuring. So you're taking away the club's lifeblood. And, of course, the thing that Tariq talks about, the fact that it's other people's money, they spent money badly. That's one of the things, because if it is someone else's money, they said Nick Carte from Nottingham Forest, Mangala, Matt Turner, and he played 17 games between them. I mean, it's not been a great stewardship, has it? And maybe we were going to get onto Palace. So the thing about Palace is that him having no control there, Palace have been a very successful club this season. I was at the Palace celebrations of them winning the cup at Selhurst. I didn't hear many mentions of John Textor that night, I have to say. If Steve Parish is the guy that is the front man, and Steve Parish actually perhaps deserves some credit for not giving Textor the control that he wanted of the club, considering what's happened at Lyon. But, I mean, the thing is, it's not just John Textor that's doing these things, is it? But it does appear to be that investment opportunity across borders that, as you say, Jack, needs to be regulated. The chances of it being regulated, I mean, this week, I think, did we see that EFL clubs are now allowed to own clubs in Scotland and Ireland and stuff like that? I mean, I always felt it was like smaller clubs wanted to be against multi-club ownership because they didn't want to be taken over. Like, you'd have that, in US sports, you'll have an MLB team will own a minor one down the leagues and stuff like that. That model's been proposed many times over the years, hasn't it? And now it appears that the turkeys might be voting for Christmas over that. A football club, as we all share, perhaps, those who do this podcast, it should be its own entity, should represent its own fan base, it should represent its own community. But this sort of conglomeration, this globalization, produces situations that you've got at Lyon and a situation where you've got at Crystal Palace, whereby the greatest season in their career is threatened by this very this practice of multi-club ownership.
And we've definitely seen some pushback, I think, from fans against the idea of being included in a multi-club model. Like, as John says, as a football, if you support a football team, it almost goes without saying you want your club to sort of stand or fall by itself. You want it to represent you. You don't want to just be a cog in some other big kind of supranational machine. And we've seen this a little, there've been, I think, some of the European clubs which have been connected to CFG, that's City Football Group. At Troyes in France, there were lots, there have been protests against how that's gone. I think NAC Breda in the Netherlands have been, there's been pushback. Obviously, City have tried very hard, or CFG rather, have tried very hard to get involved with clubs from all the way across Europe. But I guess what I'm interested in is very easy to see. It's very easy to see the downsides of this model, right, Tariq? Like, everybody knows the damage that it can do. Everybody knows why fans don't like it. Can you see anything on the other side of the ledger? Can you see any upside for either the clubs themselves who are brought into it, whether that might be, I don't know, Girona have obviously done pretty well in their CFG era, or can you explain why owners keep trying it?
Yeah, well, I haven't seen it. It's too early, or it might not be. I haven't seen one that really works. City's a hard one because obviously UAE, and they can afford to spend a lot of money. It's quite hard from a purely financial base. But what they talk about are these so-called synergies, where we're going to get best practice across the board. We've got the big team's got a great marketing arm. We'll do all of this stuff for you, tactics and training and all these best practices that you probably wouldn't be able to afford. We're gonna we're going to give them to your team as well. But honestly, so far, all I see is these are people who are kind of on the make, as it were. You are trying to build a conglomeration of clubs, thereby increasing the value and hoping to flog it to somebody else at some point. No one is coming into this for the basis of improving football. And no one paid attention to it. Now we have so many of these multi-club ownership groups. So when you look at the EFL agreeing to it, and you can think, well, they're almost in a situation where everyone is doing this thing that has been allowed to happen. So we're in this situation. I'll give you an example of where this can be used in a way that it's almost unfair to teams that aren't in this. And it involves Lyon in 2023 and a team called Molenbeek, one of the other teams Textor owns. There's a player there, Ernest Naumann. I think he's Ghanaian, and he was a forward. He was like a very, very, very good player. I think he was in Denmark. Lyon were under some sort of transfer embargo because of their messy finances, but they really wanted this guy. So what happened was Molenbeek, Belgian team, broke the transfer record to sign this guy for 25 million euros. And their transfer record before that was 3. And he immediately gets loaned to Lyon, who can't sign players or buy players, but they get this player on loan. And it kind of is a hack on the system. Clubs were up in arms, etc., but nothing really happened. So that's how they used it, and people were complaining to FIFA and all sorts. I'm not sure any of this is healthy for football, though. Even if you look at this, who is it good for?
I mean, it's increasingly prevalent, though, isn't it? I mean, Leeds United it's fair to say, have had a torrid last 20 years or so. Have been bought by this 49ers ownership. And then this week they find that they're going to be their owners are going to own Rangers as well. Now, you can already see that if Leeds do become, let's say, Leeds United again, a mid-table team, they could end up in Europa League, where Rangers might very probably be. And so you've already got that, you've got those UEFA regulations, and it's just, you can see trouble ahead. Another example I could think of is when Michael Edwards, sainted figure at Liverpool, who departed as sporting director or director of football, whatever you want to call him, and then returned to the club after Jurgen Klopp, or around the time Jurgen Klopp was departing the club. What was stated as the club announced his return was that he would be looking into multi-club ownership for Liverpool. Now, Liverpool is its own entity, isn't it? You can't think of anyone more identified than Liverpool. But they looked into buying Bordeaux. That didn't come off. They didn't think it was a good enough deal. They've been linked with Getafe in Spain. But, I mean, it eats into what we expect a football club to be. Now, okay, the world moves on. The high financiers have got involved in football since, that initial Glazer deal, which I suppose, broke the mould for all of these things. From a political point of view, I was looking at one of the family members of the 49ers group was given a pardon by Donald Trump. It's all it's all interlinked, and as you are a football fan, you find yourself drawn into these various things. More and more people will find themselves in a club that it's like, oh yeah, I support Leeds United, but I support Rangers. Now, I'm old enough, and I think Tariq is too, to remember the Leeds Rangers game back in the early 90s being, absolutely one of the greatest fixtures I can remember of the last 30 years. Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic, wasn't it? But they can't play that now because, the multi-club ownership thing has come in because big business has moved in and made it difficult. It's just it's the changing of the rules to fit in these innovations, and I use that in inverted commas, it constantly goes against the spirit of the game.
There's a mention of Trump again with Palace, isn't there?
Yes.
With the guy who's potentially buying John Textor's stake, and again, the drama around that is so Crystal Palace can play in Europe because of these MCO rules. So this guy, a guy called Woody Johnson, the owner of the New York Jets, which is constantly reviewed as the worst team owner by the players themselves. They do a health check across all the different NFL teams, and Woody's Jets always come up worst. He was an ambassador to Britain under the first Trump term, and now he might be the owner of Crystal Palace. And only recently I heard he was told there can be something called relegation in the Premier League. So we're looking forward to having Woody at the Premier League.
And obviously, John was just talking about the challenge of having multiple teams from the same family of clubs competing in the same UEFA competition. Tariq, this is something that UEFA have clearly been wrestling with, let's say in inverted commas, for a while. Do you think this is something that they want to regulate, or do you think this is something that they want to work around?
If you ask me, I don't think UEFA want to regulate anything, quite frankly.
Right.
All right. These people, we've been around this for so long now. There's been a pattern, and it might just be this is just how it's fallen, and it's just the big clubs just get lucky. But it seems like the big European elite football clubs always seem to get around the rules, and if someone is to be hit with a ban or something severe, hello, Bulgarian team qualified for Conference League, sorry, we're gonna have to punish you. So with MCO, what have UEFA done? This clearly in their rules, it says there's a certain percentage threshold, and you can't be in the same competition. So what we've seen since the Red Bull era, this is Red Bull Salzburg and Red Bull Leipzig, is this idea of a blind trust. So you pop your other team in a blind trust. What is that? That's some sort of arrangement where you can have no control over what's happening. But look, WhatsApp group, hi mate, what are you doing with the team this week? How is anyone going to control any of this? It's incredible. We had the Nottingham Forest owner, Marinakis, getting his clubs prepared, put Forest into a blind trust, and then we have him marching onto the pitch the same week that he's apparently not in control of Nottingham Forest. So I don't think anyone really wants to control any of this stuff. Palace are unlucky that UEFA decided that they are going to be really looked into because their blind trust arrangements came in after the March deadline. So it looks like they're doing something. But, maybe ask someone else who is more certain UEFA are a great governing body and are doing everything they should, and they might give you a different answer.
I was going to say, Jack, that the club that you follow closely was a bit of a pioneer in this. I don't know if you remember this. ENIC Group.
The first ever multi-club model.
Yeah, and they're still... it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes whenever I go to Spurs, people still refer to them as ENIC, which I find quite quaint.
Yeah, so for the benefit of our younger listeners, ENIC, which is basically the company that owns the vast majority of the shares in Tottenham Hotspur, which was set up, ENIC was set up in the 1990s by Joe Lewis, and then the sort of currency trader, and effectively run by Daniel Levy, his protege. And obviously, they bought Alan Sugar's majority stake in Tottenham Hotspur in 2000, but before then they had lots of other different investments like Planet Hollywood restaurants and software companies and all sorts. But they decided, and they were miles ahead of the curve on this, to try to set up Europe's first multi-club model in the sort of mid to late 1990s, which involved them taking big stakes in Rangers and Vicenza and FC Basel and Slavia Prague and AEK Athens I think that's it over the course of the late 90s.
Yeah.
But I think they ran into, this was an era where, because nobody else had done it, I think there was a bit of pushback really from UEFA, I believe, at that point. And, because ENIC had, I've just looked it up, they had 96.7% of Slavia Prague, 99.9% of Vicenza. So these are pretty chunky stakes. And eventually they had to step away from all of this and decide to focus just on one club. And in the end, that one club became Tottenham, the club which Daniel Levy supported and which Alan Sugar was keen to exit after a pretty punishing time in the 1990s. So John's right. Like, this is an idea that's been around for longer than you might think. Although only really, I think, kicked off again with, I guess, in public mind, I'd say the Pozzos.
Yeah, and the City Football Group as well around the same time. The City Football Group, as Tariq says, it almost feels that whole entity supports the mothership, really, doesn't it? It supports the one at Manchester City. Although, they've had success in their individual leagues. Particularly, it's almost like the newer clubs, isn't it? The New York City and the Melbourne City appear to have been a bit more successful in their sort of newer leagues. And obviously, and Girona as well, which is that sort of slightly weird arrangement where it's 50% shared with, is it Pere Guardiola? The weird thing about Girona is they seem to be like sort of yo-yo, don't they? One season they'll be really, very good, and then the next, the relegation threatened. And that's a story I looked into at the time, and Manchester City we're quite protective of that story. I didn't really want to tell you too much about it until it happened. And, of course, their old friend, Javier Tebas, had quite a few things to say. And, of course, they had that issue, didn't they, about, again, like the thing in France, the measurement of evaluation of players. He questioned how, it was players that were very good were given low valuations in their accounting, and this was disputed, and actually became almost, I think probably quite a few legal letters were sent over that particular dispute at the time. Probably best for us not to get into it, actually. But it's always that sort of area is where you're moving into. It's that fraying edges of legality and commerce and stuff like that, which, as always, is very little to do with the football itself, but that's the way that the game is going, and it's what we hear discussed most of the time, it would appear to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think the benefit of the multi-club model is so... I mean, so in some cases it's not clear, but in some cases it's very clear. I think the recent example I can think of, the obvious upside to this, is Savinho. So Savinho is a very talented young Brazilian player, played for Atletico Mineiro. In 2022, he signed for Troyes, that's the CFG team in France, or rather, and then he had a loan to Girona. He had a loan to obviously CFG team. Before that he had a loan to PSV, and then in the summer of 2024, he signed for Manchester City for £30 million, which is actually, £30 million is not, a pretty modest fee for
Did he ever play for Troyes, Jack?
A 20-year-old Brazil international. No, I don't believe he did play for Troyes.
This was one of those things that City fans in that sort of social media thing were, it's all perfectly above board and all that sort of thing. It's all above board. It is. I mean, it's allowed, as we say, as Tariq says, that the regulations are loose, but there's a sniff about them, there's a whiff about them, isn't there? Yeah.
It's a very whiffy market. But the 30 million is going to yourself if you think about it as well, isn't it? Because your parent company. So it's a snip. But that is the I guess if you were to design the model, Jack, it's a really good point. Now, if you're thinking about you're finding talent in various places in South America or in West Africa, you think they might make it. You think this guy might be a one, but he might not be. So what would have happened is that they might have gone to teams 2 or 3 levels beneath where you are as a very top elite team, and but if they do make it, that could end up costing you anything between 30 and 60 million. But if it stays in your tent, you have groomed this guy in your system, and you're benefiting from it. And if he doesn't make it, you can then trade him sort of horizontally across to the level he's at, and you might even make a profit on him because he's gone through your City system, if you will.
It did occur to me, what would have happened if Liverpool had wanted to sign Savinio from Troyes, or Arsenal, or Chelsea, or Manchester United? The whole thing, I mean, John mentioned earlier the Pozzos and Watford and Udinese, and I just want to wrap this segment up by referring back to, do you remember the Championship playoff final in 2013, which pitted Ian Holloway's Crystal Palace against a Watford team, I believe managed by Gianfranco Zola? And this was quite early on in this process, right? And Watford had
this
lots
was following Troy Deeney scoring the greatest goal.
Yeah, exactly, in the semi-final against Leicester City.
Yeah.
And Watford, as well as having Deeney, had a bunch of very, very talented players who had been loaned from Udinese. Frankly, the level, I mean, we're kind of used to it now, the Championship having players of such high quality, but at the time, it felt quite unusual that Watford would have. They had players like Marco Cassetti, the kind of veteran Roma defender. They had Matej Vidra, who went on to be a big, score tons of goals. Joel Ekstrand, Daniel Pudil, Akechi Anya. They brought, and then they were able to bring on players like Forestieri, obviously, Christian Patocchio, another big Argentine star, lots of whom had come into Watford via Udinese or in some cases Granada. And Holloway was one of the first people to sort of spot this. And I remember, I think it was maybe a TV interview or a press conference before the Championship playoff final. I remember Holloway having like a list of Watford players, and just pointing to it and saying Udinese, 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 Udinese. And when I think back to that now, it reminds me of, you get like a moment at the start of a film about an asteroid hitting the Earth where one scientist would spot something on his computer which suggests that we're all doomed, and he'll try and tell everyone like, we've got to stop, we're all in trouble, and nobody listens to him at the time. And that's basically how I look at Ian Holloway 12 years on, as being the man who knew where we were headed with multi-club ownership models, and how we laughed at him at the time, and wasn't he right? Hi, and welcome back to Libero. We are going to get into some more John Textor chat, but specifically looking at the successes of Botafogo. So Botafogo are one of 4 Brazilian club teams, all of whom have made it through to the last 16 of the Club World Cup. I think this is amazing, really, because I don't think, the other guys talked about River and Boca on last week's episode. River and Boca have been terrible at the Club World Cup. Neither of them have made it out of their group. It's obviously, there's an oddity, right, that there are 4 Brazilian teams because each of them have qualified by virtue of having won the Copa Libertadores in the last few years. So Brazil are the best represented nation at the Club World Cup. And, the fact that there have been 4 Brazilian winners of the Libertadores in the last 2 years is itself part of the same story here, which is the rise of Brazilian club football, the rebirth, I guess, renaissance of Brazilian club football in recent years. But all 4 of those teams have made it through, some of them in very difficult circumstances. Like Botafogo have made out of a group with PSG and Atletico Madrid, which nobody would have expected them to do. Palmeiras, scraped a draw with Porto, managed to win Group A, the group into Miami's group. Flamengo managed to thump Chelsea, I think one of the most impressive team performances we've seen so far. They've made it through. And Fluminense also managed to scrap their way through Group F after getting a draw with Dortmund. And they're all... So I think all of these teams, have massively overachieved so far. I'm just wondering, John, what have you made of the Brazilian teams in the Club World Cup so far?
Well, I always had this inkling that they would be pretty decent because, as you say, they dominate the Copa Libertadores. And when we, in Europe, see those teams play, it's often out of season, isn't it? Or it's, when we see them play this Club World Cup, in Saudi or various worldwide locations, we only ever see them against the best team in Europe. We only ever see them against, say, Liverpool or Barcelona or Real Madrid, whoever it is. And then you could readily dismiss South American football because of those one games. The fact is, Brazil is the cradle of world talent football still. I mean, it's not quite as it was, but I mean, if you want a good defender, they're going to be playing. They're still the masters of those, strong central defenders. They still turn out great talent, the likes of, I mean, he's not at the tournament, sadly, Hendrick or whatever. And so there's such talent there. And also, and we've just touched on this in the pod, there's a lot of money in Brazilian football these days. The thing about Brazil as a country, as opposed to Argentina, and I know that the economy fluctuates a fair bit, it's its own entity. It can look after itself. One of the things you notice when you go to Brazil is that they don't really need the rest of the world. They've got enough resources. And at the top of the society, things are going pretty well. The logistics are okay and things like that. So it's not really a surprise, because I suspect these teams are a bit more professional than perhaps us in Western Europe probably suspected. And also, they're in mid-season, they're fitter, and they play a style of football that is also suited to those conditions, because almost every time I watch the Club World Cup, I switch it on and they're having a break because it's too hot to play. So it's, but yeah, I mean, there's been some pretty decent performances, some players that have stood out. I mean, Igor Jesus, I suppose we must call him, of Botafogo. Is he off to Forest? I think he is, isn't he? Already.
Textor and Nakis deal, you suggested?
Yeah, the lads already cracked that one through. Yeah, Esteval Willian, who's also got to Chelsea. I mean, this is one of the sadness of these things, is that there is also that carrying thing of the Western European clubs, isn't there? That they're already the European clubs. They pick off these talents, and this might be the last we see them play in Brazilian football till they get to the end of their career. But there's so much talent there. It's no little surprise for me to see them. I think some of the European teams, remember how the process we arrived at the European teams, we're not seeing the best European teams either, really, are we? No Barcelona, no Liverpool, no Napoli.
Tariq, have you been surprised by the success of the Brazilian club sides?
No, yes and no. You've got to separate them from the Argentine teams. I think John alluded to it. I think the Copa Libertadores now is going to be a procession of Brazilian winners. It already has. I think the last 4 have been Brazilian. 6 of the last 8 have been Brazilian v Brazilian in the final. So that's a direction of travel. A couple of things have happened in Brazil over the last period of time. Now you can own a team. So it used to be that members model. These were sports clubs. Botafogo, for example, when I moved to Rio in 2013, I wanted to go for a swim. I had to join the Botafogo club. It was the nearest one. It's a sailing club. And a lot of these teams are football and sailing clubs. These are historic organizations. But the government passed a law last 3 or 4 years where you can buy a stake. So John Textor ended up owning Botafogo this way. Josh Wander in 777 ended up owning Vasco. And Manchester City, or the City Football Group, they own Bahia up there in the northeast of Brazil. So this is fresh capital comes into this market, which is already the richest in South America. Brazil is a continent-sized country. The TV rights are quite valuable. The biggest teams in Brazil do touch the top 30 in world football. Yeah, so those European teams they're beating, some of them aren't as wealthy as, say, a Flamengo or a Palmeiras either. So you've got this, and then something else is happening, which I found really interesting, and it started with the Vini transfer. So Vinicius Junior, who went from Flamengo I think he'd played 1 game or a few minutes for Flamengo before it was announced he was moving for 45 million euros to Real Madrid, which was incredible at the time. That level of fee was not the norm. Rodrigo then goes from Santos for the same amount. And Estaval, we mentioned from Palmeiras, had already signed for Chelsea. He's going to finish this, and the value of that could be anything up to 60 million euros. So I was talking to the people behind some of these moves and said, what's happening now is we're sending them even earlier than we did for these massive fees. But what that's enabling us to do in a way is bringing back players earlier than they might have done before. So instead of going to, I don't know, Russia, we probably wouldn't want to go there at the moment, but leagues like that, or even some of the minor Gulf leagues, they come home. So look at Flamengo's squad right now. You've got Danilo, who's played for Juventus.
And City.
And Man City. You've got Jorginho, who's just come back from Arsenal. Alexandro, Juventus. You've got Gerson, the captain. He's played for Marseille and Roma, early 30s. And they've also managed to get the best South American talent as well. You've got Georgian de Arrascaeta, hard to pronounce. He's like a legend at Flamengo, Uruguayan player. You've got others there, Mateus Viña, De La Cruz. There's 100 Uruguayan caps in that Flamengo team. And Uruguay, big national team. So I think slightly surprised that all four of them have gone through. But these are serious contenders. And then you look at the motivation factor. I know we're going to get a lot of stick from this, from South American public. The European teams are not as motivated, and maybe they should be, but patently, for this competition as the South American ones. And it has been the case of the Club World Cup before, and it is now. You could see it by the type of fervour in the fan base that is there. And that's great. It's given us that context and backdrop. And you could also see it on the pitch. The players are going mental. They're flying into every tackle. They're trying to win this thing in a way that maybe some of their opposition are not. Come the knockouts, let's hope the Europeans up their game, and we'll see some real contests.
So I was in the US the last few weeks. I didn't go to any of the games, but what I did see, the only really visible sign that I saw of the Club World Cup was so many Brazilian club fans in New York City out and about. You'd see dozens and dozens of Palmeiras fans walking around downtown or walking around Central Park, all in their matching green Palmeiras tracksuits every day. And clearly, and it was a bit like that experience which I had both in Russia and in Qatar, which is you go to the World Cup like kind of assuming, or with a very like Eurocentric hat on, thinking, I bet there'll be lots of England fans out there, or I bet there'll be lots of Germany fans out there. And in both Russia and Qatar, I kind of realised very quickly that for every one England or German or Denmark or Holland fan I saw, there would be 500 fans of Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, etc. Like the big Latin American countries just travel in like unbelievable numbers for these tournaments. And I kind of, and so over the course of my time in the US, like I think I saw one guy in a City shirt, one guy in a Chelsea shirt, versus hundreds of people who'd clearly gone en masse to support their. Mainly, I saw Palmeiras, Fluminense, and Flamengo. I didn't see so many Botafogo fans, and so you just got a sense in this, like how, and this ties into what Tariq was saying about what we saw in the pitch. Like for these teams, the motivation is colossal for this, and it actually kind of changed my mind a bit about the tournament, because I think, like a lot of people, I went in with the view that this is just pointless and weird and silly and gross and all fake and all the rest of it. But then actually kind of when you see how much it means to a lot of the teams playing, and when you kind of get a sense that if you're a big Brazilian team and you've won the Copa Libertadores, then it's very natural that you would be thinking, well, what's the next challenge? We want to play against the best teams in the world. We want to play against the best players and the best managers and the best coaches in the world. And this is our chance to do so. And it's actually made me, even just seeing that and seeing these Brazilian teams, has actually probably made me like reconsider a little bit what my preconceptions about the tournament, while obviously we all know why it exists and why it's in the US and how it's funded and so on. So I think I've kind of now had those two sort of thoughts in my head at the same time.
It's funny, the emotion it's brought back to me is that of almost like 30 years ago when I was a schoolboy, which is this idea of a world game. not just the World Cup. And so, as a reader of world soccer, you would read the updates from Brazil, and all these exotic names that one day might end up in Europe or whatever. But the idea of those clubs like Flamengo, like Fluminense, like Botafogo, like Palmeiras, they retain that exoticism, and then they are now playing on a world stage that they probably have been denied for, because of essentially because of the world's geography, and the fact that the European teams, with that financial dominance that they've had, probably don't want to play a South American team too often, because it's not that great a look, is it, to lose to a we go back to the Intercontinental Club World Cup, old style, two-legged system, and one of the most legendary games when I was growing up, and I was a bit too young to recall it, was the Flamengo Liverpool game, the Zico, and Zico was a name that was spoke about on like playgrounds around the world because of that game and his performances in the World Cup, and amid Gianni's machinations, has brought that sort of we are the world feeling, and not by design, I wouldn't suggest, but having the Brazilian teams do so well has been fantastic. The Argentinian teams brought their colour, but they also brought that idea that yes, Argentinian football is not in a great state despite its talent, and actually, you think of the Argentinian national team is still leaning on Lionel Messi, for God's sake, and it's brought a part of the world, football world, that I'd sort of forgotten about for the last 25 years, because my job involves me Premier League, Champions League, focused on that, and thank God for the Brazilian teams. It's been great. Maybe we should hope next time around, wherever this thing's going to be. Do we know where the next one's going to be, Tariq? Any idea this next tournament?
Well, now there's talk of Spain and Portugal or other wanting it as well. Brazil apparently really want it. And look, in terms of Brazil, just the attention as well. I had a scan of Globo, the main media company over there. The number of stories about the Club World Cup, I mean, it's wall to wall in terms of the website. Dozens of stories all over this thing, and it's a kind of a different perspective to what we're seeing even with some of the countries, some of the teams that are there from Europe. But the other thing is, it's not just Brazilian clubs; these are all individual clubs as well. So maybe through this, people will, like Flamengo, for example, is so big. It reminds me in a way how Benfica got big in Portugal. These are teams that got big because of radio. Before television, football was consumed by radio, and Benfica in Portugal, for example, was pushed across. They were the dominant team, Eusebio's team, and everyone in Portugal, I'll take Porto out for a second, and and maybe the sporting fans in Lisbon, they would have Benfica and someone else. So Flamengo is enormous, and there are teams that aren't here that are huge as well. Think about Corinthians, for example, from Sao Paulo. That's a massive fan base. Yeah, and if I was thinking Botafogo, who won this thing, it would be like they're very modest in this context, in this company. It would be, I don't know, maybe Palace and Botafogo make sense together in a way. But wouldn't it be amazing if Palace went on to win the Champions League? So you can imagine that when Botafogo won the Libertadores, what a big deal that is, all winning the league. So maybe we're getting some of these flavours, and people who have had their interest piqued by watching them might pay a bit more attention and sort of look into this, maybe as we did when we were kids.
And finally this weekend, we've got the climax of the European Under-21 Championship, which Lee Carsley's England are looking pretty good to retain, John.
Yeah, Lee Carsley, his star shines once more after that period when he actually did quite a good job for England, and he's, as a caretaker goes, won the Nations League group, didn't he? But yeah, he's managed to get to the final where they'll face Germany with only 2 players remaining from 2 years ago, which is some achievement. One of them is perhaps the star of the team, Harvey Elliott, and the other one is Charlie Cresswell, who you may remember from Leeds, but I think plays for Toulouse now. And it's been a real triumph for Lee Carsley. There was a bit of a wobble in the group stage, an unexpected defeat of Spain, a big win over the Netherlands, who are always so good at bringing through talent. I think credit due to Carsley, credit due to the fact that English football is now bringing through a lot of talent. I mean, for years it was the 1984 team won that championship, which is, included a group of players that, became quite obscure quite quickly. And it's a hell of an achievement to the English system. English teams too go quite far in these competitions these days. We're used to it at senior level. And Lee Carsley was, I just think about to his regime. The stuff about the national anthem was absolutely crackers. And the fact is that he showed that a manager who was adventurous tactically, but couldn't really speak to the media, was going to be no use to England, because that's what it's about, and it's about so much more than that. And now we've got Thomas Tuchel. How long will it be until people start yearning for Lee Carsley to take over that position again? I'm sure certain chaps on the Fleet Street beat are already carving that piece together, don't you?
Yeah, look, I really liked Lee Carsley from my time covering him as interim England manager. I thought he was. No, I've never met anybody who has anything other than nice things to say about him. He really stands out for me as having this is quite, I think, totally unique. No ego whatsoever, but weirdly, like, more than that, like, almost no kind of. Because of that, he almost never spoke up for himself in public. He would never make the case for himself. I think he struggled with the sort of sharp-elbowedness.
Yes.
That you need to be a sort of top-end manager. And the players, particularly the young players, adored him. Like, all the young players, and I'm sure this is just as true now of the guys who are in his 21 squad as it was of the cohort from 2 years ago, many of whom went into his senior team. The players love him, but I think that the way that he struggled to tread the line on the questions about whether or not he wanted to be England manager or whether or not he should be England manager, I just think that is that side that he would need to improve if he were to be to take the kind of the very intense media glare that comes with being the England seniors manager on a permanent basis.
Jack, do you think, as someone who's watching from the outside, when it comes to, say, England the national team, I've followed them that closely for a while, but Gareth Southgate, the thing he was almost better at than being a football coach, maybe, was being a communicator. So his almost superpower was being a communicator. Completely. So the guy who comes in next, you're going to be measured. Well, hang on, we have this guy who people thought maybe he should be a prime minister or something, and then a football coach comes in who's a football man, and that maybe that kind of immediate whiplash done for Carsley as well. Maybe is that fair at all?
I think so. Yeah, I did think that there was. I felt that contrast very clearly, particularly the first international break when Carsley took over in September. And then, because Southgate by the end had such a kind of like weightiness to everything he said. Like, he kind of felt like he kind of agonised over every single question, but he was also prepared for everything, and he would never start a sentence without knowing exactly where it would end. And he had this real kind of Archbishop of Canterbury quality, Southgate. Whereas then all of a sudden he left and Carsley was in, and Carsley, talking to Carsley was just like talking to any other football manager, and he didn't have that same. I mean, charisma's the wrong word. That same kind of presence, I think, that Southgate did. But it's interesting that in the end, England have decided to go for Southgate's long-term replacement is someone who's also an unbelievably good communicator. Like Thomas Tuchel is an unbelievably good. Yeah. I think in a press conference, in an interview, he's so chatty, he's so clever, he's candid. I think probably maybe more candid than Southgate was. Maybe measures his words a little bit less carefully than Southgate, but he's unbelievably confident in how he expresses himself. And I just think that, for better or worse, that is what the England job is now, really. And I think that Carsley, for all his many strengths as a coach, doesn't really measure up in that aspect.
Yeah, to continue I suppose the Glastonbury theme, Southgate and Tuchel are the front men, aren't they? That's what the FA wanted when you hire someone like that. You can see Lee Carsley quite happily, on base or something, slapping away just in the background. He's one of the. He reminds me of, especially when you go lower down the divisions. You like a Mark Robbins or a Richie Wellens or someone like that. When someone you're speaking to who will give you, and that's not to say that other managers are dishonest, but will give you an honest answer. Will just give you what has happened and his view on it. And actually, remember, he's asked about the succession. I'm going to go back to being under-21s coach. Everyone sort of missed that bit. That he actually was like, there actually is, and there actually has been an England manager appointed, even though he knew about it. And then he actually told the truth. But because everyone is so used to this web of, sending messages and hints and all this, that, oh God, they have actually appointed a manager. And then Tuchel has announced the next day. Very, very funny. A well-regarded man. Let's wish him luck, right, on Sunday night. Yeah.
Good luck to Lee Carsley and the England 21s on Sunday, and we will be back again next week. Thank you so much to John, Tariq, producer Tom. Thank you to everyone for listening, and thank you even more if you leave a review for us on Spotify or on the Apple Podcasts app, or spread the word about us on social media. Thank you.